Good afternoon. For those of you who are new to us, welcome. My name is Adriana Link, and I'm the Assistant Director of Library and Museum Programming here at the American Philosophical Society. Very happy to welcome you again, both in person and online, live on Boxcast. Hello to today's program. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. We also wish to acknowledge their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. The Society also acknowledges that it has benefited directly from being an occupant of this part of Lenape lands, now known as Philadelphia. Because of that, in particular, through its Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, the Society seeks to promote research that honors Indigenous knowledge, cultivates scholarship, and strengthens languages and cultural traditions. And we express our sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and multiple opportunities for collaboration that have really made the work of the Society and of CNAIR possible. How many folks are new today? Show of hands. Yeah, okay, we've got, welcome. So I'll do an abridged spiel for you. So if you're joining us for the first time, the Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin to support the promotion of useful knowledge. We do have a membership society. Election to membership honors those who have made significant contributions to the sciences, humanities, and public life. We also support research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants to folks a year on projects that span those fields. Our library and museum that's located right across the street. We have collections and research scholars that serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. And as always, if you have any questions about what's going on here, please visit our website, www.amphilsoc.org. So for today's event, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome back Brooke Bauer, who will be discussing her book, Becoming Catawba, Catawba Indian Women and Nation Building, 1540 to 1840, which she completed, we were talking about this over dinner last night, that she was able to complete during her Mellon Foundation Native American Scholars Initiative postdoctoral fellowship that was here at the APS. I'd like to remind folks who may be watching online, though, before I welcome Brooke, that we are still accepting applications, particularly for our Indigenous Community Research Fellowships and also for our Digital Knowledge Sharing Fellowships. So if you have any questions about those, please take a look at our website and get in touch. The deadline for those is this Friday, March 15th, so please do it sooner rather than later. With that, though, I'd like to welcome and introduce today's speaker, Dr. Brooke M. Bauer, who is Assistant Professor in the History Department at the University of Tennessee and a citizen of the Catawba Indian Nation of South Carolina. As I've mentioned, she is the author of the book that's the topic of today's lecture, Becoming Catawba, and was also, in addition to being a NACE Fellow, was also a Phillips Grant recipient. So Brooke has had a long experience working with us in our collections, and it's really quite a joy to be able to welcome her back to share her work with us. So with that, please join me in welcoming Brooke to the stage.
Thank you. It's so good to see you all here in person and everyone online. A lot of what Adriana has already said, I was going to say. Many thanks to Adriana for the invitation to return to the APS and give this talk. And I really want to express my thanks to the APS, not only for inviting me to talk about my book, but, of course, for the financial support over the years. As Adriana said, I was awarded a Phillips Fund grant for Native American research in 2013, and that's when this project was in its infancy. I still had no clue what I was doing. Later, I was awarded the Andrew W. Mellon Native American Scholars Initiative's postdoctoral fellowship, 2020 to 2021, during Philadelphia's COVID shutdown. So NACE, the fellowship, the feedback from other fellows, a manuscript workshop, and of course, social distancing gave me the critical time that I needed to finish my manuscript. So I'm always grateful for my time at the APS as a fellow. My book, Becoming Catawba, developed from my research about one Catawba woman, Sally New River. I had heard of her as a child. I'd listened to my grandmother and other women in my family describe her as a very influential person of the nation. I heard local journalists identify her as queen, a label that I kind of struggled with because my people, the government didn't act as a monarchy did. And in Catawba language, there's no word for king or queen. So the little that we do know about Sally's life left me with a ton of questions, not just about her, but about Catawba women of her time and how they lived in the early American South. How did they fit into the Catawba narrative? What part did they play in coalescence and nation building, in change and continuity? Historians who wrote about Catawbas like James Merle did their best to include women in their research, but they likely faced the challenge of finding sources, as I did. The sources that mentioned Sally and other Catawba women were written primarily by white men who had their own biases. I'm not going to get into that in detail. However, it wasn't that Catawba women were not present in the archive. They were there. I just had to ask different questions of colonial documents. Questions like I've already mentioned. Questions that on the surface sound simple, like where are the women? What were the women doing? But in fact, these questions are the answers to these questions are very complex. For example, Catawbas deeded over 500 acres to Sally in 1796. And while this land indenture was a legal contract, this the state of South Carolina recognized it as such and filed it in its own court records. I approached the document questioning what it could tell me about Sally. For example, why 1796? Why is it that Sally's name is the only name mentioned on the contract? It says Sally New River and other women of the said nation. Those women are not named anywhere on the deed. Why 500 acres? And of course, a slew of other questions. The deed explained a lot that we typically don't think of at first glance. And I sat with these two handwritten pages for a while and thought about what is written in this document. And I discovered the vital roles that Catawba women filled within their own society, and especially Sally. Sally was not, well, she was a unique Catawba woman. She was the daughter of a former leader, one of the most recognized diplomats in Catawba history. She would marry a leader of the Catawbas. So she had a different status within her own society that I will say it privileged her in certain ways beyond what other Catawba women experienced. I learned by looking at this document how Catawba people held women in high regard because of their connection to fertility and reproduction. Both of these are interconnected with women managing the land. I learned the document recognized women's improvements to land, homes, agricultural fields, burial grounds, and the Catawbas strategically used the American legal system to reinforce the centuries-old custom of women managing land. Other sources that I relied on included maps, songs, language, archaeological reports, and all these different materials helped me reconstruct the world of Catawba women. Most importantly, I and the Catawba women of my family were sources. We are the keepers of hundreds of years of traditional knowledge. In the end, and after many revisions, I was able to reconstruct the world of Catawba women who lived during a traumatically transformative period. Put those two words next to each other when you're talking. So I do focus on a period of 300 years. This is necessary to really dig into the lives of Catawba women and the changes that they experienced, but also how they responded to these changes while holding on to certain traditions. They helped to build or create and build a nation, create a Catawba identity over this long scope of time. And what I'll talk about today is Catawba women as potters, but this is only one part of the story of Catawba perseverance. So like I said, I blend historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and oral tradition to give my readers a more inclusive story of Catawba women's lives. Catawba potting traditions reveal continuity, even as change enveloped Catawba women's world. Analyzing clay harvesting and pottery making helps us see how pottery shaped Catawba's identity as women went throughout the state bartering their pottery. Their roles as potters provided a supplemental income, albeit a very small one. It kept Catawbas visible as a distinct people, distinctly Indian, and reinforced Catawba's education and lifeways through kinship, connection to a homeland, and shared practices. So I would like to just kind of focus on the latter half of the 1700s just because of time limitations. And so I ask you just to imagine, it's May of 1760. You are in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, living in a small Catawba village that resembles a European hamlet of maybe less than 25 to 50 people. The small town typically bustles with activity from early morning to sundown as children play and men whittle darts for blowguns. On this particular day, it's early morning before the sun has fully risen, and you hear women quietly moving around, talking in hushed tones. They gather tools they need to dig clay. The group of women of different ages, with one or two men, carry cane baskets of food on their arms and walk toward the Catawba River, which is less than a mile away from the town, and there they will spend their day harvesting clay. The men had a special role in collecting clay. Their responsibility was the manual labor of digging 6 to 8 feet deep to reach a, quote, clean, unquote, vein of clay. After a day of harvesting and sharing stories of the past with one another, the group returned home carrying those emptied baskets. Remember, they were full of food. Now they're empty. They're carrying those baskets full of clay. And women will use this clay to make pottery, to either use in their homes or to barter for foodstuff or clothing. The women will spend the days cleaning and processing the clay, another few days making and burning pots. This envisioning is one that Catawba women created, is one way that Catawba women created and promoted a Catawba identity. This is distinctly Catawba, passing the clay harvesting and pottery making practice from generation to generation. While we have no direct evidence of any clay digging or pottery making days from the 1760s, we know there were days like these because of oral history, archaeological evidence, and the clay digging tradition that Catawbas continue to practice today. We continue to use some of the same clay holes that we've used for hundreds of years. Analyzing these sources together, we know that late 18th century Catawba women made a lot of pottery. Sometimes they made pots as a collective group, which provided, an opportune time to pass down skills and knowledge to younger Catawba women. Pre- and post-1540 Catawba sites in the Piedmont region of the Carolinas hint at the continuity of potting practices, a tradition that has survived over 4,000 years. And it continued with future generations. So this is from a 1560 site. And you can see the different types of incising on both the pot and the shards. And this is pottery that was found at a 1780 Catawba town site. It was occupied for about 20 years. And so you see this continuity of the potting tradition. Before 1759, women made large pots with conical shapes, like this pot here, narrow necks, and stylish inscribing, and other exterior marks that these pots held food such as corn, peas, acorns, stews, and even partridge oil. They used it like butter. Catawba women nestled these pots snugly in a bed of hot coals, often leaning them upright in a burrow of rocks, warming and cooking food. Catawban-speaking people also used large clay jars with deerskin tied tightly around the top rim to make a water drum, a musical instrument used during feast ceremonies and at times of defense. Although the styles and markings changed over time, and especially in 1762, which is what you see with these pots, the pottery remains distinctively Catawba, primarily because Catawba women made the pots and instilled their essence or spirit into each piece. Pottery making has always played a significant role in the lives of my Catawba relatives. I think specifically of the amazing women from my family, my mother's lineage, who sat in their yards building pots in the most humid time of summer August. If you've ever been south in August, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes they gathered in small groups to share their potting skills. Other times they sat alone in their homes building or rubbing a piece of pottery. Each woman in my family has learned to make pottery in the same way, by watching the hands of their mother and grandmother. Catawba girls in their teens often apprenticed with their grandmothers, learning the many steps to make different styles of pots. When a girl made her first piece of pottery, her teacher carefully evaluated the pot, making sure the coils were correctly blended into one another so there aren't any air pockets between those coils that would bust during firing. So symmetry was also another important component of the assessment. If the pot failed to measure up to the teacher's expectation, the girl had to start over in building the pot. But she only reached this stage after watching her teacher make pots. This visual style of learning imprinted images of the building steps of various pottery styles onto a younger generation. Later, younger women recalled the memories and began making pottery to supplement their household income. The process described above was significant to a young girl's transition to womanhood and is a practice that Catawba women have followed for thousands of years, a tradition that passes to future generations and ties women together through kinship. And this is exactly how I learned. I learned under the tutelage of my grandmother, and many people identified her as a master potter. And so I was in my young 20s, first learning how to make pots, made my first bowl, and we used like a 12 by 12 piece of wood, or maybe even just a little tiny bit larger, so we can make the pottery on that wood. We can build it up on that flat surface. And then we can pick it up and we can turn it to see the different sides, tell what is symmetrical, what is not. Well, of course, in my 20s, I thought I did a fantastic job. And I called her over to my table and I asked her, I said, can you tell me what you think of this? And she did exactly that. She picked the board up, and she's probably 5 feet, if I give her that much. She was a tiny woman. And so she picks this board up, and she's turning it around, looking at it, and she sets it back down on the table. And she looks at me, and she just says, you're going to have to start over. It's not right. That's important. It's not right. And then she proceeded to draw her hand back and flatten the pot. I learned a really important lesson that day. I learned how valuable clay is to my people, because if we had moved forward and fired that pot and then determined it wasn't worthy, it wasn't, the value in it wasn't there, there was nothing we could do with that pot. You can't melt it back down, which means putting it back in water and letting the clay get pliable again. So I learned a really important lesson, and a lot of people are shocked when I tell that story, but I love that story. And I've heard other people, other Catawbas, say she taught them in a similar way. And this it imprints on your mind the value of our clay, because our clay is not bought from a store. We do go and dig it out of a clay hole near the river. And then there's a lot of processing that goes along after that. We do this all by hand. even making pots, they're hand thrown. We don't use a wheel, and we don't use a kiln. We use an in-pit fire, just like our ancestors did. So, in the 1760s, women really moved to the forefront in bartering and selling their wares. Pottery was the product of their labor. They owned it. Men didn't barter for them. These women went in and haggled for what they needed. Meanwhile, the British population in the South Carolina region grew, and the area's economic prosperity expanded, allowing many backcountry settlers to live, quote, comfortably in respect to every article necessary for the support of life, and many who were just the other day indigent are growing rich, unquote. So population growth and economic development were especially evident at the Irish Quaker settlement of Pine Tree Hill, where Catawbas would move after the tragic 1759-1760 smallpox epidemic that really devastated the population. After this epidemic, estimates of population were less than 200. At Pine Tree Hill, a really busy backcountry trading center emerged. By 1758, colonist Joseph Kershaw, also a mercantile agent for Anne Crumlance in Lucock, he established a store and a mill in the growing settlement. 10 years later, the Pine Tree Hill settler village had a gristmill, a tannery, a meeting house, a bakery, a brewery and distillery, those are really important, a brickyard, and additional mercantile stores, and of course several other homes. In the same year, Kershaw petitioned the South Carolina Assembly to change the town name from Pine Tree Hill to Camden in honor of Charles Pratt, Earl of Camden, a member of Parliament. So Pine Tree Hill is really significant for Catawba women in becoming itinerant potters. So before the outbreak of the American Revolution, Catawba women's pottery economy benefited from backcountry settler difficulties that I just mentioned in terms of the South Carolina Assembly was protesting British revenue policies by signing non-importation and non-consumption agreements, which means a lot of the trade materials like ceramics were no longer making it into the backcountry because of the boycott. And it was in this absence of these trade goods that Catawba women really stepped into the backcountry economy. They modified their pots to mirror English ware, adding some stylistic changes. For the first time, Catawba women made pitchers similar to English Wedgwood tea and coffee service pitchers. Catawba potters named this pitcher the Rebecca pitcher after a Catawba matriarch. They made footed beaker pots, kind of like cooking kettles, pans, cups with and without handles, plates and cooking jars. They made a sort of pan. It's more like a bowl, known to Charleston customers, especially the women, as a milk pan. They made pans and bowls with thin, gently sloping walls and plates with slightly rounded walls, brims, and flat bases, much like creamware and pearlware plates. So, let's see, what time do I have? Catawba women were industrious, and they experienced with new potting forms. I just want to talk a quick minute about these maps. And what is significant is you see the Camden-Charleston path that connects Charleston at Camden. This is going to be the path that the Moravian potters from Bethbara, common-day Winston-Salem, North Carolina, would travel with wagons loaded with pottery, like 600 pounds of pottery. And I used the second map just to kind of situate where Salem was in this trail. And so these are people that Catawba women would have seen, would have probably met, although we don't find it in the archives, or at least it hasn't been found yet. And they picked up some pottery making skills from the Moravian potters, especially how to make pipes out of clay. So Moravians used a mold to make their pipes and, manufacture them very quickly. Well, Catawba women picked up this practice and started doing the same thing. So you see influences on Catawba pottery from outside of their community. Let's see. The milk pan that I talked about, this is one that's attributed to Sally New River. And you can see it's not real large, but they called it a milk pan because especially the ladies in Charleston loved to fill this little pot up with milk and then wait for the cream to rise. Anybody in here know what that cream was? Can you guess? It would be butter. Yeah. And so those ladies really liked this. They also used Catawba's okra pot to cook okra stew. And they were quoted as saying that okra stew is not good in any other pot but a Catawba pot. So, they had really reached out in South Carolina and were bartering. And along with this, itinerant pottery selling, well, not really selling, but bartering, they're also projecting a Catawba identity. They're recognized by white and black alike as Catawba, not just Indian, but Catawba, for the wares that they make. So the rest of this is in my book, if you're interested in reading it. But I'd like to, take the last 15 minutes to answer any questions that you guys may have. It doesn't necessarily have to relate to what I've talked about, but I'm open to questions.
Great. Thank you, Brooke. So I do have a microphone, and I'm happy to walk around if folks have questions in person. And then if folks online have questions, we're monitoring that chat, so feel free to ask those as well. Anybody in the room have a question? Yeah, I'll come to you, Renee. I'm walking slowly in these shoes, though, so give me a second.
So thank you, Brooke. I have more of an artistic than an academic question, which is, as a native of North Carolina, I'm familiar with the red clay, just dirt
Right.
that I grew up with. And I was curious whether the clay that you dig is similar in consistency and color?
No, thank you for asking that question. We don't use the red clay. The red clay just doesn't build well. We use what my grandmother used to call gold or butter, because it does have this yellowish tint. And then for bigger pieces of pottery, we add what's called blue clay. And this is a more gritty clay. And so adding that to the pan clay, the yellow clay, helps to strengthen walls when you're building larger pots. It's just tempered, right? Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay, this is a popular table.
Did you start with coils?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you smoothed it?
Yeah, oftentimes they used a large shell or something, a piece of wood to help smooth it out from the inside, and then they would use their hands on the outside to smooth it out and make sure those coils were not recognizable.
All right. Hey, thank you. Another person from North Carolina who came out to hear you today. But I was curious, when the Catawba women were trading their pottery, what were they bringing back, or what were they trading for? Was it for currency or for other goods or textile? I don't know. I'm just curious.
No, that's a great question. Typically, so when they're bartering like the milk pan or larger pots that have a lot of space inside of them, if they want coffee, they say you have to fill it twice with coffee grounds. If they want corn, you have to fill it, once, twice, 3 times, whatever. They set the terms. And so with bowls, it was what could fit into that bowl that they needed. They did barter for textiles, but I can't say how they did that.
Yeah, okay. We have lots of time, so if you have questions, please let me know.
Thank you. What's the range of the Catawba people? I was associated with northern New York for some reason or other. I don't know.
So, let's see. From 1763, this little square box that you see in the black and white, that was the negotiated 144,000 acres that a Catawba leader agreed to without consensus at the Congress of Augusta in 1763. So this is post 7 Years' War, like right immediately after. But before that time, I don't know if it shows. Before that time, Catawba-speaking people had occupied lands going north up to the North Carolina-Virginia line, had gone west as far as the east as far as the M in Camden, and then west to what's known as the Broad River. And then further south. Yeah. Well, there is a story that was published by a white man, and I can't remember what year it was, but he argued in that story that Catawbas originated around the Lake Erie region. And if you ask my people, they would tell you, no, we've always been here. There's no evidence that we know of to suggest that we once lived there. Everything points at the South Carolina, North Carolina Piedmont region. Yeah.
So we have a question online, and then I see some others in the room. So we'll go online, and then we'll come back.
Yeah, a question online from Tamara Calkins says, I'm curious about the diagram as a technology on the cover of your book. What is the date of that diagram, and is it representative of a style of communication?
So this is a map that was first drawn by a Catawba man sometime around 1721, and it was drawn for the governor of South Carolina at the time. I think it was Governor Nicholas. And so this map, if it's spread out, I wish I had the full map up here to show you, but Nassau, the town, that big circle, is the center of this man's world. And that's why he positions it in the center. He is actually from the Nassau town. And he identifies at this time as a Nassau person. The other towns, all the native towns, if you notice when you examine this map, are circles. The European settlements are squares. They're linear squares, which you see a little bit of Virginia there. And so this both shows trade networks, those paths leading from town to town, but I argue it also shows the kinship connections from town to town, because women would not have married within their own lineage. They would have married out of their lineage and possibly into other towns, men from these other towns. And so by the 1760s, all these towns are just 3 towns. And that's because of the smallpox epidemic. But also it shows that coalescence in Indian country is not an uncommon thing that was happening. Many tribes across the Southeast were taking in refugees, were taking in, whole towns and building up their populations. So coalescence was a strategic practice to really reinforce their identity, but also their sovereignty.
We'll take one more online, and then we have one here.
How
Okay, or we'll do one here, and then we'll go online. Go ahead.
how large were Catawba families, and how large is your family?
Oh my goodness. I can tell you, my grandmother had 125 grandchildren.
You had a question? Okay.
Yeah. And, in the early 1900s through probably the 1950s, Catawbas had large families. And they needed large families to help take care of everyone, whether it was farming or fishing, whatever.
Quick follow-up here, then online. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for you. Thank you.
Yes.
To start, you talked about these, you said in 1760, I think it was, that the Catawba settlement was sort of the size of a hamlet or looked like a hamlet. I didn't quite understand that statement. Number one, what was the population before the smallpox hit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the population size of the Catawbas, there were 6 towns before the smallpox epidemic hit. And there were approximately 500 people. We don't know with certainty what that population was because a colonial trader came through the towns and just numbered just counted the warriors, the men who could fight. There are retired warriors in these towns that were not counted. Children were not counted. Women were not counted. So we go with an estimate of about 500.
All right, when you talk about, what did the housing look like? What, were they, I don't know, were they tents as we knew them, like wigwams, or
They were
something else? Were they
actually-
more house-like?
It was more house-like. It was
Yeah.
made of wattle and daub. So basically, that's clay mixed with grasses. So it's not
Okay.
unlike how bricks were made early on.
Gotcha. And lastly, you said that you started your first pot when you were 20 years old, probably because you were on some sort of academic line at the time. Catawba girls, typically, what age were they? What age and what were the? Were there any ceremonial aspects around them learning to do this coil work?
Thank you for asking that. So when I learned from my grandmother, it was part of my Catawba identity. It had nothing to do with my academic identity. I wanted to learn from her. It was really important to learn how to make pottery from her. And there were other women, Catawba women in the community that I also learned from, women who are my elders. And that's really important because that kind of relationship, that apprenticeship, is what connects us together through kinship, but it also shows the continuity of this practice. You know, it's a 4,000-plus-year-old practice. And I would think, you know, I can't say what I would have thought at the time, but I don't think doing it for an academic purpose would have kept me as invested in it as knowing that it's part of my identity of being Catawba. Not everybody makes pottery. That doesn't make them any less Catawba. It's just something that I felt I needed to learn.
So we have one more quick question online, and unfortunately, I think we'll have to share other questions with Brooke afterwards. So we'll do one more online.
Yes, a question from Douglas here. He's asking about the designs on the pottery, specifically if you can identify any women from various regions or years.
So yeah, and that's most noticeable in the towns, the 6 towns that were occupied from around 1750 to 59, because there's been archaeological work done on two twin towns. That's how they're identified, Nassau and Waiapi. And what, if I'm remembering the breakdown correctly, is in the northern half of these towns, women did corn cob and corded markings on the exterior. Then in the middle of the town, it was more burnishing, so rubbing the pot to bring out a high glaze on it. We don't use glaze on our pottery. It's all, you know, naturally honed. And then in the southern part, there was incising done on the pots. So the way I looked at this is these are 3 different lineages, matrilineages, that are living in different parts of the town and practicing pottery, building pottery as they were taught. And so that's why we see that delineation.
Great.
Well, I mean, I'll say I really always have appreciated the ways that you bring the material and your own practice into the scholarship in ways of kind of reading against what may or may not exist within the archives. And I think this talk today has been a really good example of how to do that in both an engaging and a provocative manner. So I hope you'll all join me in thanking Brooke for this really spectacular talk. We do have a couple of copies of the book on sale at the back if you want. And thanks again. It's really wonderful to have you back.
Thank you all.